and welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, with a special guest, and I'm along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. And we have a real doctor on the show, Mr. Lopkin, today, Dr. David Carroll Gore, and he is going to talk about his book that is in process. And uh, uh, Mr. Lopkin, we talked about a couple months ago about that whole phenomenon called nets with the newer generation. No employment, no employment, no really training, no education. So basically, you would have it as a failure to launch, and then we have some other topics as well. But Dr. Gore, Dr. David Carroll Gore. You can talk a little bit about your background and your book that I believe is going to be upcoming, at least is in process.
So I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been doing this since 1984, 85-ish. I've been licensed as a psychologist in Georgia since 88. I'm a family therapist. I work a lot with families, so I'm pretty familiar with the NEET phenomenon, but most people know it as failure to launch, which has nothing to do with my book, but here we are.
Or the movie.
Movie.
Let's talk a little bit about your book. There's someone, could be loosely connected, but why don't you get into that and share that with our listeners?
So a lot of people think they have a memoir in them. I know I did for years. And when I finally started writing my story, I was coached, I was advised to hang it around the scaffolding of my legal battle with my ex-wife. So she and I got divorced. We had a daughter who was around 4 or 5. And when she was 6, my ex-wife accused me of some pretty horrible stuff. Mm-hmm. And what that created was a world where I couldn't see my kid, and I was fighting against visible and invisible foes, police department, child and family services, a bunch of lawyers, judges that were too busy to hear the case.
May I interject one question, please?
Sure.
Very compelling story. So, but there was nothing in your background. There was no previous instance that would justify any kind of attention. Just to clarify that in this process.
To clarify, yes, I am a good dad. I was a good dad. I've never done anything remotely like I was accused of. And it's unfortunately a phenomenon that happens more regularly than people are aware of because no one really wants to talk about it. My case was pretty specific, but when I talked to other people about the book, for example, an editor I spoke to said she was pulled away from her children by her ex-husband, who coached them to not go to her house, to stay with him, to choose his place over her place for holidays and vacations. And I think, unfortunately, it's happening all day, every day. Divorce is a horrible thing, but the divorce industry is not helping matters at all.
And is that what your upcoming book centers on, the divorce industry, if you'd like, for lack of a better word?
Well, to be honest, it centers on me and my lovely daughter, who's now 29, who has read the book and given me the thumbs up to go ahead and seek out a publisher. And that's part of what I wanted to do today. Is if any of your many listeners know someone in the publishing business and are interested in talking to me, here I am. So the book centers on the battle, but it's also the story of me and her. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but it ends okay.
So maybe, I'm just, again, not having read the memoir, was there any kind of falling out between you and your daughter during this process, and then eventually it came full circle? Is that fair enough to say, or not at all?
Well,
everything was okay to begin with.
No, she was pulled away from me, so there was no contact. When she re-engaged with me after 7.5 months, she was okay. I mean, she was young, so in my brain, it felt like she was 9 or 10, but she was actually 6. And the reason I say 9 or 10 is I remember her being bigger and older than she actually was. I have a 6-year-old neighbor who lives across the street, and 6 is young. So my kid was blessed with going through this struggle, but not remembering a whole lot. So by the time we got re-engaged with each other, it was pretty easy. It was pretty much a non-event. And
Now
the unification went well.
You say this is not uncommon. I have to ask the question: if it's not uncommon, what's the motivation?
I would hazard the motivation is when people get divorced, they don't like their future ex-spouses, and there's a lot of fighting, usually around money and custody. They hire lawyers, and the lawyer and his or her client wants to win, which means I want to get money, I want to get more time with my kid than my ex. I think most people could resolve that situation in a day or two, but because lawyers are incentivized to bill as many hours as possible, they could take days, weeks, months, even years to resolve those two big issues. And then the cliche is a lawyer will bill their client for $20,000 to fight for a couch that's worth $500.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Dr. Lopkin, before we get into the failure to launch segment, any questions for Dr. Gore?
Yeah, just one. As you've said, lawyers tend to bring this out because the more hours they bill, the more they make. But when you're dealing with children, especially, but the adults as well, what is the psychological impact of drawing this conflict out?
Terrible. It's terrible because kids get put in the middle. They get denied time with either parent, and sometimes they feel like a pawn because they're aware they're being used as a pawn. But even if they're shielded from the ongoing fight, like they can't hear it or know what's going on, they feel it. There's an energy. They know when they're with mom, they're not allowed to say anything positive about dad. They know when they're with dad, they're not allowed to say anything positive about their mom. Kids know when it's safe to like both parents. And I think that's one of the biggest harms of divorce and the divorce industry is it makes it really hard for a kid to float between the two homes, which is difficult in the best of circumstances. But when everybody's not getting along, it's very hard to float between two homes.
Certainly would make sense, without a doubt. Now, in terms of the overall process, if you were going to put a percentage on it, what percentage of divorces, because I've heard this before, end up in the situation that you've just kind of articulated? It's more than most people would think, correct?
Yeah, so statistically, if 1 out of 2 marriages end in divorce, I'm going to hazard 30 to 50% of divorces are pretty ugly and contentious and drawn out, and there's a lot of explosions and a lot of shrapnel being thrown around. 50% of divorces probably go pretty smoothly. But I think there's a lot of accusations. There's a lot of, it's a win at any cost phenomenon. And if I ask a divorce attorney, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? They'll answer, and they're being honest. They're saying, hey, I'm just advocating in the best interest of my client. Hey, I'm just doing what my client's asking me to do. And that's, they believe that. But a better answer would be, I don't know how to get my client to just let every other Thursday go. Like they want to die on this cross of, I don't want my ex to have the kid every other Thursday. Mm-hmm. And it's insane because it's a long game. Like you're going to have a kid for 18 years under these rules, but then after that, we all know, those of us that have been around a while, relationships with your kids don't stop at 18. It happens at 20 and 25 and 30. And when your kids are grown, they have choices, and the easiest, best thing to do for when you're going through a divorce is tell your kid, come stay with me, come stay with your mom, and everybody's okay. Not a big deal.
Now, on the subject, before we move on to the Nets situation or failure to launch, do you have a title for the book?
The Atomic Bomb of Divorce is my current title.
That's not dramatic at all, is it, Dr. Lockett?
Not at all. Before we move on to the next topic, I just want to clarify something. You're estimating that half of all divorces end up getting ugly. And that's fine. That's probably accurate. But you also mentioned the stat that 50% of marriages end in divorce. This statistic has been widely disproved. The rate of divorce is much lower than that. That is, nobody really knows where that statistic originally came from, but it's been debunked widely. There's no validity to saying that half of all marriages end in divorce.
Including marriages number 2 and 3 and 4, which have a higher rate of divorce, which trends that number upwards?
Actually, that would make some. Go ahead.
Even so, the statistic has been debunked. I don't know what the number is, but it's much less than 50%, even considering second, third, or fourth marriages.
Okay, I mean, this would not be the first mistake I've made today.
I just want to clarify for our listeners. Yeah.
Okay, there's a high level of divorce. What it is, probably less than 50%, but certainly a lot of divorces, which leads us to the next subject, and that is something that Dr. Eric Lopkin and I were talking about a couple months ago. We talk about political topics, obviously, but we also talk about various other interesting subjects as well, and that's why we have you on the podcast today. And one thing I heard, saw this, and I actually read some articles about it, is the younger generation. They get confused, millennial, Gen X, whatever, but very young people, I'm going to probably speculate 18 to maybe 25, they have a phenomenon. Now, when I got out of college, it was all the 80s. Everything was about achievement. So it was like dinks, dual income, no kids. It's all based on the trajectory of achievement. Okay, that was the focus. Now they have a new acronym, and that's called NETS. No employment, education, trading, training, and certification. And it's what you say, Dr. Gore. It's really a failure to launch. So we talked about, or we've addressed, and I've read, articles about that it is happening, but I'd like you to shed some light on, from your perspective, why it's happening. Because for someone that grew up, came to age, I should say, in the 80s, it seems so counterintuitive that that this would be occurring. Because at least from my perspective, that's a time where achievement and building things is basically part of the DNA. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it begins with parenting today. I think it begins, if we're going to go back to the 18 to 25-year-olds, and we're talking about parenting, 20 years ago. I think there's a lot of over-parenting. I think there's a lot of what they call snowplow parents who smooth the path for the kid. It used to be called helicopter parents. I heard somebody say in Canada they call them curling parents. So just imagine a parent with those brushes on a broom trying to sweep the path for the kid. And I think these young men, young women, they grow up without resilience, without any grit, without an ability to face any obstacles. And life's hard. And when life's hard, you have a choice, which is to work harder and overcome the barrier, or go home, get a home-cooked meal from mommy or daddy, and watch TV and play video games and scroll on social media. And that's a lot easier than getting dressed up, going to a job interview and getting rejected, and then, picking yourself up and going to another job interview. So I think there's some societal.
Doctor, just real quick, is from my own perspective, this is kind of interesting. I actually have thought, obviously not in the area of psychology in any way, no training whatsoever, but I had a friend who I grew up with, and his parents, especially his mother, did exactly what you just said. Snopa. He didn't have to get a job. If he did something like grew up, like I don't know, I don't know, skip school, throw a snowball at a car, whatever. It was all no problem, nothing. And fast forward years later, he's been fired for many. He's incapable of almost, and he's got a high level of education as well. And I always thought that was not the ultimate, but a form of child abuse, not to have it, not allowing children or kids to go through what you just articulated. In other words, the ups and downs.
And I guess my question to you would be, when this friend fails, how does he eat? How does he put a roof over his head?
Even though he's a very good educational background, he manages to say, flip by. I mean, he went from having a really good job, and now each time it's gotten less and less on the food chain, so to speak. So he has managed to survive, but he certainly squandered opportunities that were in front of him, and I think, again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think in part it's because, again, he didn't no grit and never having to face challenges and
But
not
I guess
being penalized for go ahead.
my question is, does he return home and he lives with his mother or father,
No,
or both of them?
he did. In fact, that's a good question. Until he was, I don't know, I'm going to throw it out, 40, he was living with his mother.
Yeah, I'm going to take the position that that's a two-way street. The kid
100%.
decided, I'm not going to grow up, and the mother decided, I'm going to allow my kid not to grow up. And I think we could all
100%.
agree.
Yep.
I think we could all agree a different mother at age 22 or 23 or 24 would have said to the son, enough, get out of here. But a mother needs to have her act together to do that. So if I'm a healthy mom and my kid's 22, 23, and I say, all right, enough already, go, get out of here, chances are pretty good I would have raised my kid better than that I wouldn't have been in that position. So it's a real quandary there. If you're healthy enough to kick a kid out, you probably are healthy enough to raise a kid that doesn't need to be kicked out. So, I don't blame the parents, but I certainly see mom and dad as a really good place to start to work on getting this kid to grow up. So you're not asking me this, but when I treat this kind of issue, I do individual work with everybody, mom or dad or the kid. But the main thing is I do family therapy, and we talk about the enabling. Now, something that we haven't touched on yet is the anxiety issue. Moms and dads are very anxious. They communicate to their children. There's a lot of bad stuff out there, and I'm going to give you a lot of anxiety. I'm going to give you a lot of things to worry about. Look at the news. Today, school shooting, literally a couple miles, 20 miles away from me here in Atlanta, Georgia. And when you hear that, you could communicate to your kid, don't go to school, stay home. Or you communicate to your kid, look, bad stuff happens, but you got to go to school, son.
Dr. Lockman, have a question?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about one of the causes being, the problem with the parenting. But once someone gets past that point, they're, maybe they're about to leave the house, or maybe they're still in college and, not quite ready to leave the house. When they start to see what the real world is like, if they're in that situation, what can they do to help turn themselves around at that point?
I think the answer is pretty simple, which is you don't quit a job unless you have another job. You don't go out and eat dinner if you can't pay rent. If you have no friends, you don't stay at home and play Call of Duty all night. You get off the computer, you go out, you make some friends. and you network and you get better jobs. I 100% agree with you. There's a point when the kid needs to take responsibility for him or herself. But I also think mom and dad need to step up and stop the enabling and force the kid to learn how to live better, to learn how to live a more productive life. I think, I don't know if I'm wrong here, but I think today, kids, if they don't like their jobs, they quit. When you and I were growing up, if you didn't like a job, you just stuck it out and
you looked for another one while you had the job.
You know, it's kind of interesting. Hold on, I think this is really interesting. Years ago, when I was getting my MBA, and it's not, this is not, rocket science, but even back then, companies were starting to lay off. And I remember my professor says, "Don't let anyone tell you any differently. When you don't have a job, you're damaged goods." And that has stuck with me because I found out it's actually true.
Yep. The big gaps in your resume don't look good. But that reminds me of another phenomenon, which is, I do pretty okay. My wife, she's a professor. We have money, but our kids have always worked. And when you're 16 and 15 and 17, you don't get great jobs. These kids have worked in restaurants, babysitting, yard work. And they're in a position when they're older to have a job and know whether it's a good job or not because they've had bad jobs. A lot of kids graduate college, they've never had a job, so they go to work, they think this is a bad job. It's not a bad job, they've never had to work before. So I think, I know you guys like to talk about economics. I think kids need to have bad jobs before they could appreciate what a good job is.
Interesting concept. Never heard that before, huh, Dr. Lopkin?
It is a good concept. And I think that's, people seem to forget that was actually what most minimum wage jobs were meant to be. These weren't meant to be jobs that, that people are feeding their families on. These were jobs that high school kids were taking as a first step into the job market.
Yep.
Well, as we conclude the topic, and you've been a great guest, I thank you so much, Dr. David Carroll Gore. Thank you. But I have a final question for you. And you talk about the individual, how it happens, why it happens. Fascinating information. But what impact does this failure to launch have on the greater society? I mean, it's got to have some impact.
I don't know the exact answer. My feeling is it can't last. It can't be the norm to be living at home when you're 25 and 30 and 35. The stunted growth, the emotional inability of people to be independent and be on their own, if it keeps on increasing, then I don't know how that's going to end. Now, as I'm saying this out loud, in the old days, you used to live at home with your parents and your grandparents, and it takes a village. There's something to be said for that. But I think in the old days, everybody was contributing. The slackers, the ones who just live off of mom and dad, it's not going to end well for anybody.
Agree.
No,
sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Lopkin.
I think what you're saying is very important, and we should point out that there is a difference between somebody who's living at home with their parents and living off of their parents while they're not, going out and getting jobs and things like that. There's a difference between someone like that and someone who is living with their parents but contributing to the household, who is working, who is, maybe contributing to the food budget, possibly even paying rent. So there is a difference between the group we're talking about that is dependent on their parents and having this failure to launch. It's more than just someone living at home.
Dr. Gore, I think it's an excellent point. Dr. Gore, I have one final question. It's less emotional than just, sometimes you think, okay, it's got to change and things will progress. But like I think we were talking before to prep for this podcast a week ago, and I saw a TikTok video of this young lady, and Dr. Locken, you couldn't believe this. She was literally crying about she got a new job. I seemed like a college graduate, and she was crying and lamenting about how it's interfering in her dating, and now she can't go to dance class and blah blah blah. And I'm thinking, you've almost made yourself unemployable because now, background checks are pretty extensive. How many companies are going to hire? So, I mean, could you do permanent damage by effing up for an extended period of time? More than just gaps in resumes, but posting. Yeah, I hated my boss, and so I quit. I mean, you could find yourself unemployable.
Well, one would caution against posting that kind of stuff on social media. And by the way, because of my desire to get my book published, I now am on Instagram and TikTok, and I'm at the cynical psychologist with periods after the and cynical. But it reminds me of a story where this kid got out of college and he's working on Wall Street and he's working crazy hours, which is what they do. They get there at 7, they go home at 7 or 8 or 9 at night. And one day this mother called this kid's boss and said, "Why are you working my son to death?" And the next day the kid showed up for work and he was greeted at the elevator by the security guards who gave him a cardboard box with all his materials in it.
There you go.
And
Thank you for your service. Yeah,
no, and the note on top said, "Ask your mother."
Right.
Awesome.
Because he had no idea why he was fired. Ask your mother.
Nice. So I thank you. Any final thoughts, Dr. Lopkin? I think we can certainly appreciate our guests, some really good insights. Dr. Lopkin, any final thoughts?
Just thank you for coming on. The insights were very interesting and I think very valuable.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Dave Carroll Gore and his book. What is it? Atomic Divorce? What was that? I love it. Say it again, please.
The Atomic Bomb of Divorce.
Thank you. Very interesting guest. I certainly, and I'm sure our listeners, appreciate you coming on the show. Very insightful. I more than appreciate it. Correct, Dr. Lopkin?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, Dr. Lopkin, good segment, excellent segment. And now we get into our usual subject matter. I thought that was kind of interesting because I think it gave a further analysis for a social phenomenon that I think will have certainly some huge ramifications. But speaking of ramifications, and which is kind of interesting, there was a poll that says people are starting to feel a little better. But then as we prepped for the podcast, you had some economic information that kind of goes a little contrary to that. And you're on.
Yeah,
Talk to us about that.
It's been a bad week so far for economic news. Yesterday, manufacturing numbers came out lower than expected. And in fact, it tanked not just our stock market, but the Nikkei in Japan as well. Today, we found out that the trade deficit is at the highest point it's been in 2 years, and that there are now fewer jobs available than have been out there in the past several years. So the economy is certainly tightening. Now, the good news about that is that it gives the Fed more incentive to lower interest rates, which is expected, I believe, next week. But the bad news is if you're out of work, it's harder to get a job.
Yes, and yes, very good. And also, I think you articulated about a month ago when the subject came up before, and basically, you're talking about not only people losing their jobs, but it's harder to find a job. And who does that impact greatly? Younger voters, very much a Democratic constituency, correct?
That is correct. And people are seeing, though, I hesitate to say younger voters are a Democratic constituency because that's also turns out to be a fallacy. Recent polls have showed the division of young voters between Republican, Democratic, and Independent is pretty much a mirror of older voters. So there's not really an age difference in the parties, even though they like to say there is.
Hmm. But you would certainly think with a razor thin election, it's. I just looked at a graph today. It's always been. You go back to 1980, and you go back right, or you go look right now. It's the economy. That's got to have an impact.
Yes, James Carville coined the phrase, it's the economy, stupid, back when he was helping Bill Clinton run for president. And that hasn't changed. The economy is a major factor, primarily because it's front and center in people's minds. You know, they may feel very strongly about what's going on in Israel or what's going on in Ukraine or, abortion rights or any other issue. But the fact of the matter is, the economic issue hits them every time they fill up their car, every time they go grocery shopping. I mean, now it's back to school season. I've heard a number of people saying, I can't imagine having to clothe kids for back to school now with the prices as high as they've gotten.
Good point. You know something is I think is really interesting. You might care greatly about abortion, about the war in Gaza, but it's not as emotional. When you have two kids, three kids, you're checking out at Walmart for their school supplies, their clothing, what have you, and it hits you like a ton of bricks. Oh my God! Last year it was only two-thirds of the cost. I mean, that's real. And when it
Yes,
goes on the credit card, that's real at 25% interest. It's real.
right. And that's something, we've mentioned, the interest rates, they're expected to come down slightly this month. But the fact of the matter is, that's actually going to be problematic in the short term. Because when interest rates come down, the first thing that comes down is interest rates on savings accounts. So if you've got a savings account, your interest rate is going to drop. But credit card rates tend to be among the last things to go down. So you're going to be paying more for your credit card interest, as you have been, but you're going to be getting less on any savings. And that's going to
No,
be
that's it. No, 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 no.
problematic.
That's an exceptionally great point because credit, it's not just a lagging indicator, it's a lag. Because once they
Yes.
cross the threshold, they're not, enthusiastically waiting to lower them. No, they're going to keep it. So it's going to be there for a while. And I think that is a very good observation about lower savings rate, higher debt rate
Yeah, it
and
has
interest.
been a big problem. And you know, I have to hand it to Donald Trump. I just saw a commercial that he is airing about the economy. And the economy, the entire commercial is clips of Kamala Harris saying what is wrong with the economy and how people are struggling, and then clips of her saying, but Bidenomics is working. And I think that brings the point home perfectly because again, this is something whether or not you support Harris or you support Bidenomics, everybody knows you are paying more for groceries, you are paying more for gas, you are paying more for rent than you did 4 years ago. No exaggeration. The average grocery shopping that I do is $200 more than it was 4 years ago. It went from approximately $150 a shopping for my family to 350, and we're buying the same things.
I experience that. I mean, I don't have. I'm a single person, but yeah, sometimes I just look at something like a simple thing, like some cleaning supplies. What Ajax or whatever. Who cares? Dishwashing detergent. Not is it the end of the world? No, but it went from $2 and now you go, holy sh. cow, it's four? That's insane.
In
But
fact, there was just a survey done. They found there has been a run on sausage. Why is there a run on sausage? Because sausage is a cheaper meat, and people are having trouble affording chicken breasts and steak and ground beef. So they're turning to sausage for their protein and to feed their families because it's a cheaper cut of meat.
yeah, and something that's not exactly good for you either, but that's another topic. Now, speaking about having a bad time of things, your thoughts on poor Uncle Joe, the perpetual vacation? He is, I believe, I'm more relevant than him. He's just,
Well, the
he's like
fact of
Uncle.
the fact of the matter that he has literally been on vacation for the last 2 weeks and almost nobody noticed.
Yeah,
That pretty much says how irrelevant he is at this point. And allegedly, he's still leading the country. Now, we know he hasn't been leading the country for most of his presidency. He's
no
certainly
way.
not making the decisions now. But they're trying to put up that he's still in charge. At the same time, he's trying to promote Kamala's accomplishments, which is hysterical because she's trying to distance herself from the Biden policies. And yet he's saying, well, with the Afghanistan pullout, she was the last person in the room. Her opinion mattered.
You really don't want Uncle Joe campaigning with you.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she's stuck with him sometimes. And she's psyched about that, like you would be psyched getting a bloodletting. How do you like this? Not good at all. And I'm sure at this point, I don't think it's going to be few and far between. But she hasn't had a great couple weeks of it either. Article after article, in spite of the mainstream media, looks like the sugar high might be over. Okay. And she looks like she was trying to push back on the debate logistics, which have failed. Your thoughts, Dr. Eric Lopkin?
Yes, her campaign did try to change the rules of the debate instead of the rules that Trump and Biden had agreed on. She wanted to have the mics open the whole time so that she could interrupt Trump. And she also wanted to be able to bring notes and have an earpiece so that her advisors could talk to her during the debate.
Okay, now, wait a second. If that was a Saturday Night Live skit, you might not even believe it. How do you like that? I mean, come on, an earpiece, notes. I mean, it's ridiculous. They would have said that against that Stanfield guy that I'm not pronouncing it the right way, but you get the drift. It's a
Well,
joke.
remember, though, that back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that was how the debates were run. The candidates were allowed to have these things. Biden was the one that said, didn't want to have any notes, didn't want to have anybody talking to the candidates because he thought he was going to be able to catch Trump lying. And instead, it blew up in his face. Kamala is having the same thing. Kamala has done a grand total of one interview since
Puffball.
becoming the nomination, not the nominee. It was a softball piece, but it was pre-recorded. So it was a 45-minute interview that was edited down to 18 minutes. And in that 18 minutes, even the mainstream media was going, well, she didn't do great. And she had to bring her running mate, Tim Walz, with her.
Her support animal. How do you
Yes,
like that? There you go.
and, and,
And yes, go
and,
ahead.
and
And he's no
now,
Mensa candidate either.
no, he's no Mensa candidate either. And in fact, and I thought this was hysterical, Tim Walz's brother looks like is about to jump on the campaign trail, but he's campaigning for Trump because
Oh
he
wait,
does.
before you move on, but yes, before you move on, that's very interesting. And also, we talk about the economy and how things are razor thin in terms of the polls and whatever. But we have that. We have uh, Tampon Tim's brother, but we also have Kelsey Gifford and RFK. I mean, these things Gonna kind of have to add up, don't they?
They do add up, and in fact, according to Nate Silver's latest analysis,
Yeah.
and this is a guy, he has been dead on, since he got into this. Right now, it is so close that Kamala is actually winning the popular vote, but she's losing the electoral college, which means she loses the presidency.
Mm-hmm. And that has shifted. You talk about no sugar high after the convention. You really have a situation now that Nate Silver, I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, was giving her the slight edge 52-48. Now that it's a slight edge Trump. Slight. So it is shifting. The sugar high seems to be over,
It has
especially when at
it has
interviews.
shifted, and Democratic pollsters have actually said there was no post convention
None.
bump, but the fact that they are actually touting the fact that she did not backslide during the convention as a major victory. So, I mean, talk
That's
about
really great. Yeah.
lowered expectations. But yes, at this point, and in fact, very recent polls. Yeah, everybody's focused on Harris Trump, but let's not forget there are other elections. And very recent polls now look like the Democrats may lose the Senate because the Republican.
And the Republicans might actually well they'll gain the Senate and maintain the House.
Right. So yeah, overall, the Democrats in tight races have started falling. And a lot of this comes from the top of the ticket.
And they're bailing in terms of their visible support of Mamala too, just as they did with they first embraced Mamala, and then when she became quasi toxic, they're now pulling away like Tesla in Nevada, a bunch of others, and but then they also have the phenomenon that Mala is now scrambling to defend blue states like Virginia. That can't be a good sign, can it, Dr. Lopkin? As well as her fumbling on the Gold Star issue. Not good at all either, was it?
No, the Gold Star issue hurt her, especially among veterans. But yeah, she decided she was going to attack Donald Trump for having a photographer at the event that he attended in Arlington. Well, as it turned out, Gold Star families came out defending him because one, they invited Trump to come. Two, they told him, yes, we're fine with you bringing a photographer. That's absolutely okay. And third, they invited Biden and Harris, and neither one of them wanted to show.
Yes, surprise, surprise. I wonder why they would have an earful. You know, I have tinnitus. Well, they would have instant tinnitus. How do you like that, Dr. Lopkin?
Yeah, it's hard to deal with Gold Star families when you are responsible for their loved one's death, and that's
Plus,
who
you
these
didn't say shit for the last 3 years. Plus,
right.
you were looking at your watch.
Right, and that's who these Gold Star families are. These are the families of the 13 people lost in the disastrous Afghanistan pullout.
And I think one of the reasons, Uncle Joe and Mamala didn't show up because the optics would have been maybe. How do you like this? Could be election game over if she showed up.
I don't think it would have been game over if she showed up. She can still claim Biden was commander in chief. We know that the Joint Chiefs and the generals disagreed with what he was doing and told him so, and he ignored him. She could very easily have shown support for the Gold Star families, said, I disagreed with the plan. I let Biden know that. Our generals told him it was a bad plan. And under my leadership, I promise you something like this will never happen again. And she could have turned it into a big win, but instead she chose to ignore the problem.
I stand corrected. You are once again, Dr. Lopkin, Dr. Eric E. Lopkin, correct. And we do have the incident of the accent. That was another excellent, going through the social media, the Southern slash African American accent. It's just so inauthentic. I mean, it's hard. It's cringeworthy. How do you like that?
I don't understand what she's trying to do, but
Because she's stupid.
her accents just come up at the worst possible times. And it's clearly not her accent. She's putting it on to try to ingratiate herself to the audience. Well, the audience does not find this ingratiating. In fact, they find it
Offensive.
demeaning.
Yes, and it's also her though. She's always been a chameleon. There is no real true sense, no conviction of Ms. Harris. It's wherever the wind blows. I think that's a song. But anyway, yes. Um, Finally, we've talked about this many times about the migration of blacks, which I totally applaud and respect, leaving the Democratic reservation. And late in the game, but increasingly happening, Jews are leaving the Democratic reservation. You have a woman, Carolyn Glitch, who was a former aide to Netanyahu's, believing that there will be a majority of Jews switching, again, a constituency that was 80% Democrats, that are pulling the plug, the Hamas party.
Yeah,
Surprise,
you're
surprise.
you're seeing a lot of the traditionally Democratic constituents leave the party. Why? Because the party left them. There's only so much lip service you can give to a group without actually supporting them until that group says, you know what? You've lied to me for the past 20 years. You've lied to me for the past 30 years. I'm not listening to you anymore. And that is what is happening. African Americans are going, yeah, you talk a good game, but you never come to our neighborhoods. You never deal with the issues that are important to us. Trump has been going into African American neighborhoods and holding rallies. He's been listening to people, in those neighborhoods talk. Hispanics, I believe the last polls showed they were leaving the Democratic Party at approximately 51%. And
Without
that's
a doubt. Actually, to the point of it's not going to happen this election cycle, but it possibly very well could in future, flipping New Mexico, the only state that has a majority Hispanic population. That is well within the cards, Dr. Locke.
well, you're starting
Not
to see
now.
that's the only state, but you are starting to see districts. Um, there is a strong possibility, thanks to Hispanics leaving the Democratic Party, that California may lose a Senate seat. It looks like Steve Garvey, who's running on the Republican ticket, may beat Adam Schiff.
Is that
There's
really?
there's
Because
also
wait, hold on. I'm not disputing you in any way, but it was, yeah, he's going to put up a good fight, but it's kind of over. You're saying that's changed. That's really important, Dr. Lobkin.
over the last
Speak to that.
several weeks, there are a number of places in deep blue states that are suddenly concerning to the Democrats. And this is actually why Kamala is going to Virginia, going to Georgia, because she is concerned about keeping those leads. But I was actually shocked to find out just a few days ago there are actually two Democratic congressional seats in deep blue Connecticut that are in danger of flipping.
What are they? Please, please tell me. And I'm not being facetious. Please.
Um,
Could one
it
of them
is
be Larson?
no. Larson is
Shucks.
seems to be pretty safe, but Joe
Shucks.
Courtney.
Oh,
Apparently,
God.
2 years ago, Courtney only won by 95 votes.
Yes, I
And
remember.
it looks like his seat could be flipped. And Juana Hayes in
Oh,
the
shucks, shucks, shucks.
who is
Highly qualified.
Right. She is a diehard member of the squad, and it's starting to look like her seat might flip. Now,
Thank God.
I still think flipping these seats are long shots. But the fact that the Democrats are even concerned about districts in deep blue states shows the problem they're having. Most of their constituency has had it with what they have been doing for the past 16 years. And in fact, we've heard the lone constituency that Democrats can still reliably count on are affluent white female liberals, also known in
Beautiful.
political parlance as awfuls.
There you go. Well, Dr. Lopkin, great podcast. I think it was good that we had, our first guest. I think that's kind of interesting to revisit subjects that we previously explored from a different insight, as
Yes.
well as addressing what's currently going on, as we always do in splendid fashion, my friend.
Yes, it's always great when we can get a guest on that, add a little more insight and a little different information, for our listeners.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopkin. Our listeners can always contribute to the show, can't they?
Yes, let's hear what you have to say. You can go to the Carnivore Radio Facebook page, message us there. Also, you can go to xvadio.com/connect. Let us know what you're thinking. And of course, you can hear every episode of Carnivore Radio at xvadio.com, the Carnivore Radio website, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, and other platforms that respect freedom of speech.
And once again, I also want to thank our guest, Dr. Carol Gore, for his participation in the show. And Dr. Lopkin, I'll see you next week.
We'll see you then.